Hello, everybody. Welcome to Sermon Shorts. I'm Dave Morehouse. Over these last few studies, we're looking at the 7 deadly sins. Now, can you name them right now? There's pride, there's greed, there's envy, there's anger, there's sloth, there's gluttony, there's lust. Did you beat me before I got them all out? You know, when we think about spiritual formation, one of the things that looking at the 7 deadly sins helps us to do is really to take an honest assessment about who we are and who we believe Christ wants us to become. I heard an interesting exercise a philosophy professor does for her students. She gets them to all write out a eulogy. She said, if your funeral was to happen this week and someone close to you was to write out a eulogy, what do you think they would write about? What would they highlight and at least celebrate in your life? But then it's the interesting exercise. After she gets everyone to write out a brief eulogy, she says, now you write out the eulogy you wish people would say about you. What do you want people to say about you? And if we're honest, we know that often there's a gap between what we know where we're at, and where we know we need to be. And as we look at the 7 deadly sins, we have to recognize that it's not so much, again, about condemnation, but it is about saying, why is it that I still struggle with pride? Or why is it that I know that I'm still greedy, or I'm envious? And what is it that has to happen in my life for me to really live the character or the virtues that Christ would have me to live? The fruits of the Spirit, of love and joy and peace and patience and kindness and goodness and gentleness. So again, it's about taking this time to talk about the 7 deadly sins is really about trying to lean into spiritual formation, leaning into real life change that the journey of faith of following Jesus calls us to. Well, with that said, I always also want to remind you that we're calling this series Knock Knock because there's this whole idea that in Genesis, right, that sin crouches at our door. And God warned Cain in that Genesis account, you've got to master that sin. But sin is always crouching at our door. And then we think of the very last book in the Bible where Jesus says, I stand at the door and knock. And I think it's interesting, right? Sin crouches at our door of our hearts, and Jesus stands at the door of our hearts and knocks. But the question is always this. Each and every day, you and I have to decide who we're going to open the door to. And literally, I wish I could tell you that it's just a one-time decision. And there is a one-time decision part, but also there's a daily decision where you have to say, okay, sin's knocking on my door, or the way of Jesus is knocking on the door of my heart. And which way am I going to go? Well, let's take a moment today to talk about anger and sloth. When we think about anger, anger is such a powerful emotion. And it's something that it's amazing, right, about how much when we have blocked goals, or we feel something has been done unjustly, or we feel threatened, that we can have this emotional response of anger that almost just takes over our whole thinking and rationale. And of course, when we see anger can be something that can be a great, in a sense, energy to our soul to motivate us to move to action, especially when we see something being done wrong. And yet we also know anger can be extremely toxic and destructive in our lives. So many terrible things have happened. I just want to remind you that there's a scripture verse in James 1, verses 19 and 20, and it says this, understand this, my dear brothers and sisters, you must all be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to get angry. Human anger does not produce the righteousness God desires. I think for some of us, if we have an assertive personality, the shadow side of an assertive personality is we can become very aggressive. And along with aggressiveness, we can also be very angry. Anger can take a root into our lives where it really has nothing to do with the fruit of the Spirit. It can be extremely toxic. It can come out in so many different ways through passive aggressiveness, through sarcasm, through abusive behavior. It can cover the whole gamut, and all the roots of it are really stemmed in an anger. I just want to remind you that when we think about anger, that certainly when we think about the call to be like Christ, that anger would not be a primary mark of his character. I know for some of us who know the gospel stories, we think about Jesus being angry in the temple and overturning the money changers' tables. And yet we forget, though, that the majority of the time, Christ's interactions with people, broken people who were, burdened with sin or confusion or even demonic possession, the response was often just simply gentleness by Christ's part. So I think that the challenge for all of us is that if we're going to deal with our anger, that the opposing virtue here has to be one of gentleness. Now let me just quickly talk about sloth. Sloth, to say it simply, is this. Often we think sloth is associated with that we're too lazy to get work done. And there is an aspect to that sloth implies the idea that we don't want to do hard work. But actually, when you look at the early Desert Fathers and the teaching around sloth, the idea really wasn't about being lazy about work. It was about being lazy in regards to love. And stop and think about this. I actually think that when we think about what does love demand from us, often if we're really going to love involves effort. If the spouse is really going to work through that conflict with the other spouse, it's going to require the effort of actively listening, working through a conversation. I mean, if you're going to love your child, it means you're going to have to sacrifice and give up your time and really put effort into that. If you're going to be part of a church family, it means that you're going to have to make the effort of showing up, being present, serving with others. Being willing to be intentional and humble with one another as you learn to love one another and work together and do God's work. You see, and when all of a sudden you are starting to say to yourself, well, gosh, you're right. It's sometimes easier, now think about this, that we can be slothful spiritually lazy, and yet still be very busy. We can be busy, doing very busy things, and feel like we're really being productive. And yet we're fooling ourselves because we're actually avoiding the demands of showing effort to love others well. And that's a real challenge. And I'll be honest with you, I find that I look at people who struggle with workaholism, and what they don't understand is they may actually really be spiritually lazy because they're avoiding all the hard work of love. And I think of a well-known passage in Ephesians 5 that talks about this, 5:16. It says, make the most of every opportunity in these evil days. If you really expand that to understand that, well, what kind of opportunities should I make the most of? It's opportunities to deepen my love with God and deepen my love with others. And by extension, actually have a deeper understanding of how I'm called to love myself in a healthy way. Well, to be honest with you, that kind of work, that love work, actually is way harder than just getting that third coat of paint on the house. Now, with all that said, I just want to leave you with this idea as you deal with anger and sloth knocking on the door of your heart, and instead opening the door to Jesus and following his way. I think the way we open the door to Jesus in our hearts and dealing with these two vices is two simple practices, and I want to end on this. One, if you're dealing with anger in your life, turn those anger issues into laments before God. The Psalms are filled with statements of frustration and anger about either the unfairness of life, the injustice of life, the pain of life, and they are, though, become laments where they are cries to God. If you're angry about something right now, about your work, about your own life, about a relationship, about a deep hurt you've experienced, cry out to God, just the way Jesus did on the cross. My God, why have you forsaken me? So turn your anger list into laments of prayer to God. The second thing, though, to deal with sloth is this. It's a big word that we use in Scripture, and that is just persevere. Practice perseverance. There's something about sticking in something and staying with it, even when you wake up and say, I just can't do this again. I just can't do this one more thing again. I just can't stay on this team again. I just can't hang in on this course again. Whatever it is. Or I'm going to persevere and see through a task. Because as you practice perseverance, you can go from doing external things like dealing with a certain project in your life that you've been putting off, or you can then turn it in and say, what are those things I need to persevere in, whether it be worship or serving or prayer or giving or just fellowshipping with others. And you got to persevere. So that helps, that outside-in habit of both taking in your anger issues and turning them into laments, and the other outside-in habit of just practicing perseverance really will, again, be part of that spiritual transformation as we move away from these 7 deadly sins, especially anger and sloth, and take on the character of Christ. Well, hope that helped, and enjoy the questions that are to follow.